Hello, this is Elizabeth, and I am the Catholic Lady, and we're continuing with Great Lion of God by Taylor Caldwell. This is Chapter 50, Part 2. If the Christian elders and deacons had been wary of Saul, and had consulted with him only briefly on a number of occasions, at night and stealthily, and if the Jews had fearfully avoided him, both as a heretic and as alleged and violent zealot, who would bring fresh trouble on Israel, and if they had all hoped that his presence would not be known to the Romans, they had reason for dismay, thousands praying that he would depart and leave them in peace. The Roman garrisons and officers were well aware of his presence, and spies, encouraged by the high priest, Ananias ben Nebadeus, knew each step he took and with whom he conversed. The high priest was determined that Saul caused no more upheavals in Israel. He felt a particular hatred for this aging Pharisee, a personal hatred, for he had learned of Saul's contempt for the decadent high priesthood and his denunciations of it in many cities. The Sanhedrin knew of his presence. If Saul sometimes had heard shufflings in the night, and had uneasily felt the eye of an enemy upon him during the day, and had seen shadows cast, he had attributed it to his imagination. The priests knew that Saul, the pious Jew, would not long refrain from visiting the temple, and they knew that he had a way of addressing the worshippers in synagogues, as was permitted by the law. So they kept a zealous watch on him, and on the night he dressed and began to walk to the temple, all were alerted, and in particular the Roman garrison, which had been warned that Saul was dangerous to Rome. As he walked unhurriedly in the scarlet twilight, he saw that others began to walk beside him too, in the crowded streets, men in cloaks and hoods. But he thought no evil. They were only Jews bent on their own mission to worship at sundown and on the Sabbath. That his death had been determined upon by the high priesthood would have seemed the wildest absurdity had it been communicated to him. He hated no man except liars and hypocrites and evildoers, and even for them he prayed each night with tears and hopes that their hearts would be changed and their souls redeemed. The priest had found none, not even amongst the most rigid and devout Jews, none amongst the Nazarenes or Christians, nor among the Zealots and Essenes, who would consent to appear in a body, in public, or in the temple, to denounce Saul of Tarshish. All had been approached and threatened, but all had resolutely refused. If he be of God, said the Jews, he must be disturbed. He must not be disturbed. If he be of the devil, God will smite him. The Christian elders said, he is one of us, and though he baptizes Gentiles who have not been informed of the Torah, and disputes with his own Pharisee sect, we find no wrong in him except excessive zeal. The Zealots and Essenes said, he loves and honors our prophet, Jochanan ben Zachary, and speaks of him always, and knew him in his youth, and he loves his people and his country. Though we resent his denunciations of what he terms our excesses, and calls us extremists, we have no complaint of importance against him. We feared his return, believing he would incite our people against us, but he has lived in peace. They did not mention that many of the zealots desired Saul's death, he having antagonized them. The high priesthood seethed with wrath, for these very people had frequently complained to them of Saul ben Hillel in the past. Now they were willing that he be left in peace and not punished for some vague violation of some law. Without a public demonstration against Saul, which would inflame the Romans, Saul could not be apprehended and executed. Caiaphas had warned the priest of this man, and the present high priest had vowed to destroy him. And yet this pusillanimous and complaining people refused to do their duty. I would, said Ananias ben Nebadeus, that a thunderbolt fall on Israel for its cowardice. As this was said only to his familiars, the Jews did not hear of it. There was but one thing to do. to gather a market mob and call them Jews from Asia, and have them denounce Saul either in the temple or on the street, and thus bring about his arrest. There were thousands among the rabble to do this, with bribes and with promises and with promise of excitement and violence. So long before Saul went to the temple on the Sabbath, the careful plan had been laid. It needed but the public appearance of Saul ben Hillel. Tonight he had appeared, and on the way to the temple. As Saul walked along the streets and descended them, he saw the Sabbath candles already lighted in the scarlet dusk and standing in the windows, and he saw the people streaming from the side streets, arrayed in holiday garb and moving with him toward the temple. The Queen of the Sabbath was presiding again over the hearts and homes of the people of God, and Saul's heart was suddenly filled with happiness and expectation. If some pressed too closely to him, and some jostled aside from him, and the jostlers moved nearer, he did not heed. He forgot his premonitions. Now he saw the temple burning gold against the crimson sky, and the mounts like bronze beyond it. He saw the golden dome and the thin spires and the gardens and the colonnades, all so dearly familiar and beloved, and his heart was moved strongly as one who comes home after a far journey. The temple was always crowded on the Sabbath, even the court of women and the court of Gentiles. So Saul was not aware for a few moments that he was unable to lift his arms, that he seemed to be sweeping in a tide. When he became aware, he attempted to slow his pace, looking about him in the temple precincts at the hooded men, and he saw fierce sparkling eyes fixed upon him, and teeth visible between stretched lips like the teeth of wolves. His awakened instincts shouted to him that he was about to be killed, and he tried to halt in that mass of shoulders and heads and elbows and arms and legs and feet, but they pressed closer to him and moved him on, and now he heard that sound which affrights any man, the wolf growl of hatred and bloodlust. It echoed back and forth among the columns, low, intense, vicious, and deadly. The crowd was no longer moving. The mass was retreating to make him the center of a small, tight circle, and his white mane rose on his head, and the coldness of death raced over his body. He saw the flaming torches on the far walls, and the lanterns, and the distant bronze doors standing open, and the crowded pale faces beyond the doors staring. Then he returned his attention to the panting throng near him, and made his face firm and bold. "What do you wish?" he asked, and now the snarling was silent, and there was only the hissing of the torches in the immense quiet. Then a man shouted, "You, vile enemy of Israel, renegade, traitor, despoiler, heretic, blasphemer, betrayer of the people." The crowd roared, and fists were flung up into the warm den air, and many spat at Saul, who stood unmoved, apparently undismayed. "Men of Israel," he said, when the last echo had died away, "you profane the temple with your cries, your shouts, and your imprecations." One man with a loud, sonorous voice was evidently the leader, and the others only the chorus. So Saul knew this was no chance demonstration against him, but a prepared one, and if prepared, it would end in his death. His lips were icy and numb, but his eyes looked at his enemies without apparent fear, and there was a blue kindling in them. "You are the profaner, you are the profanation," cried the man with the compelling voice. And again the crowd roared, and a sharp hot wind of fetid breath and sweat blew upon Saul, and it revolted him. But he held his place. Now he saw the leader, taller than the others, with a lean, dark face, and a thin black beard, and fiery black eyes, his complexion brown from many suns. He had an avid, excited appearance, a vicious countenance, and he whipped not only others to fury, but himself also. His garments were dark crimson and blue, and Saul saw the dagger at his girdle half drawn. It was this man who shouted to the other men now, "Men of Israel, help! This is the man that teaches all men everywhere against the people and the law, and the temple has polluted this holy place. He has brought Greeks into the temple and all manner of unclean men." The crowd screamed and yelled hungrily, and Saul quickly glanced about. Where were the temple guards, the priest? Who had called them away so that he was left unprotected? Then he knew. It was the priesthood itself, which had condemned him to death. "Away with him from this holy place," shouted the leader, "for his blood must not pollute the stones of the temple, nor his head rest upon them. Away with him to the streets." A dozen violent hands seized Saul and dragged him from the temple precincts into the streets, where the alerted Roman soldiers and their captain awaited. The Romans had been warned discreetly not to enter the temple, but if the disturbance erupted outside, they were to act. Now the waiting soldiers saw the rush of men through the bronze doors, dragging Saul with them, and his mouth and nose ran with blood. And we'll continue with the next part.